Hi, Nina. Welcome to the podcast.
It's so good to be here. I've been waiting for you to ask me to come on.
Oh, it's you're going to be pretty much every other guest. It's just going to be you and me.
Nice. Yeah.
Well, we were a little bit inspired by the recent guest I had, Craig McCluckey.
Yes.
And his discussion about culture. And since you're a much bigger expert going into organizations and talking to them about how to work together, how to collaborate, how to, you're coaching executives, it just made sense to get you on here and talk some more about what is important about creating culture in companies.
Yes. Well, I appreciate your confidence in me. And I work a lot at the level of the team and the one-on-one coaching. So I can think big thoughts about companies because I can tell usually from the first engagement, culture is kind of this invisible thread that just how we do things. And people who are in the company, especially if you've been there for a while in the organization, you aren't as aware of culture. But when you come in from the outside, it's apparent from how people communicate to where they decide to congregate, whether now we've got this whole new thing with work models. Are they a remote work environment? Are they a hybrid work environment? Or do they prioritize in-person work? So all of those things have an impact on culture.
Yeah, for sure. And, I've always believed that most companies talk about culture, but don't really know how to actively cultivate it.
Right.
And there are some great examples of ones that do, but most don't. And it was interesting with Craig that his company is only 6 months old and he's putting a ton of effort into it, which I feel like is an outlier.
Yeah.
And that's what got me thinking about we should talk more about this.
Yeah. And I thought he was incredibly insightful. Founders need to be aware because you're building something from scratch. And so it can feel like it's all driven by you. But there are some ways that you can create culture with others and not have it all be on the leader's shoulders. In fact, I think that's a better way to do it, but I might be getting ahead of myself. I do think that being thoughtful about culture is super important. And I think we've established at this point that culture matters in general. People understand that, and you can see it all the time. There's a saying, culture eats strategy for lunch. And I actually believe that's true. All the doing in the world doesn't matter if you haven't, in coaching and facilitation, what we call created the container for good work to happen. And so culture is like the big container for everybody to get work done in.
Yeah, good. So what we had brainstormed over the last 24 hours.
Yes.
Some key pillars.
Yes.
That we think are important around culture.
Yes.
Why don't you kick that off?
I will. It's fun to have you as a thought partner in this because they're things that I've thought about before, but we together came up with this idea that there are at least three elements that matter when it comes to creating a culture, and they all happen to start with a C. And the first C is consistency. And we're seeing a lot of examples of inconsistency right now in terms of culture. And expressed values. Like one of the ways that you can make sure that you are, I don't really like the term driving, but that you're cultivating culture is making sure that your values are being lived across your organization and also with customers. And so consistency between what you espouse and what actually happens is super important. And we've seen examples of failure in this and also success, especially in the social impact space or around social responsibility, because I think companies are being asked more and more to have a say or to at least have an opinion. And they also are facing tough decisions, whether it's what to include in their healthcare policies or like Indeed just passed something, added a policy where if you are a trans employee, you can actually get $10,000 in travel money to go and get care, a gender-affirming care, because we're in such different places across the United States with what states are willing to provide in each state. And so that was a way for Indeed to live their values consistently. Another example is like Target, more inconsistently, they've carried Pride merchandise for probably 10 years, so it shouldn't have been a big deal, but there was more pressure from people who believe more conservatively about LGBTQ stuff that they were upset, so they were boycotting Target, and so Target got reactive and pulled things rather than leaning into what are our values around this, what's important. I think they have a purpose around being a joyful place to shop, and I don't think it was feeling very joyful for either the employees or the customers coming in. And so it's an example where they probably were inconsistent between what they were trying to create internally and what they were trying to create externally. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think there's a couple levels of inconsistency. The first simplest one is a company says, here's our culture and here are our values.
Yes.
And the leaders that basically said that or created it are not acting consistent with what they said.
Absolutely.
And so, I think the classic example of a set of cultural values that sort of ignore the fact that the company is a for-profit company or is in a certain business, and their values sort of are at the opposite of that or inconsistent with that.
Yes.
And so the employees have trouble figuring out how to match the culture that the executives put out there with what they're actually doing and how they behave.
Yes.
And then the next level, which you talked about, is, okay, now what are the cultural values of the company? And are they consistently following those outside the company with their products and with their services?
Right.
And we're seeing examples all the time. And I've experienced examples in companies I've worked for where there's this massive inconsistency and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's going on here? If we have a cultural value around collaboration, why does everyone yell at each other in meetings and try and, sort of hurt or compete with the adjacent team that they're working with? That seems very inconsistent. And I think that's an important thing, that companies think through their values and make sure that they are actually going to live them.
Yes. And I thought Craig did a great job in your last episode, really highlighting that and talking about it almost from the place of your values or your virtues in a way. And I think what people don't always understand that we as coaches know is that people express their values in a lot of different ways. Two companies can have a value around respect, and it can look totally different on the ground. For some, respect is valuing all kinds of different opinions, and for others, respect is being on time for meetings, right? And so how a company decides to define those is partially driven by the leaders and partially driven by how the culture decides to honor those values.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
Second one.
The second one is having a connection to purpose. And, in this case, I think it's not only purpose in terms of like what's meaningful about working here, but is our culture also connected to what we want to do in the world? So a great example of this is Microsoft, which has actually had to evolve its purpose over time as it's gotten bigger and as it's matured. Originally Bill Gates' idea was get a computer on every desk, and that was super motivating for people because it was new and no one had a computer,
right? And
so we could all be super motivated and excited about that mission. Well, Microsoft had a dip because it kind of lost its sense of purpose. And I was doing work there and people didn't feel as connected to what the company did because it got so big. And it was like, oh, well, we make software. We do this thing with Office it's a mature product. Well, that's cool. But I'm over here working on cloud stuff that doesn't have anything to do with that really. So what's my purpose at Microsoft? And I think Satya Nadella was a great CEO because he came in and not only him alone, but the executive team started having conversations about, so how do we deepen our sense of purpose? How do we help our employees feel more connected to the culture at Microsoft? And I think one of the ways they did that was by expanding to being about helping people achieve more and empowering people and organizations to achieve more. And so that's a much more aspirational purpose, much harder to measure, but purpose and vision aren't really supposed to be measurable. That's where goals come in. But it was something that everyone could aspire to. And so that was why I think it's one of the big reasons, in addition to doing some good product development, as you know, that Microsoft is doing as well in the big 5 or big 6 tech companies as it is.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that companies need to, be able to connect the dots, so to speak, on that. And that's a hard thing, to connect the dots to what are we doing for our customers?
Yes.
And what is the purpose of the company and how does that reflect in the culture? and how does the culture then help the company achieve its goals. He's done an amazing job there.
Yes.
In pivoting that, and it actually has reflected in the stock price.
Yes.
And the return to shareholders. Took a long time, took a lot of work, took years, but a big turnaround for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, number 3. You're laughing. You want me to talk more?
No. No, I think it's good. I think number 3 is actually co-creating the culture. And this is the thing I hear the least about when I'm talking to leaders, because of basically we have centuries of focus in leadership on kind of a top-down approach.
Right.
And so, you're reading this amazing book right now that's all about how much we've been influenced by, a Central European or a European definition of and a white male definition of what it means to be a leader. And the reality is that a lot of culture gets created by the grassroots, by people on the ground. And so I think leaders, it doesn't mean that we don't have a hierarchy inside organizations, but I think leaders really miss the mark when they think all of it has to come top down and from them. Because, if you're not living it in your recruiting department, and if you don't have people working on the ground who are excited about working there, then all the talking in the world isn't going to make that much difference, right? And so you can see this in how much people advocate for the companies they work for, right? And so I think that, grassroots means that you understand what your employees care about and how they're expressing the values in the company. I think it's why companies like Disney have had a slightly easier time navigating some of the issues that they've been dealing with in Florida, because they have more support internally for who they are in the world as a company.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think, the interesting thing is that cultures are these living, breathing things. And so as you go to push a cultural change,
yes,
you have to listen to people, and does it resonate, and are they amplifying it?
Yeah.
And is there that feedback loop?
Right.
And I think that's a real important aspect of that. And also just the fact that something may emerge that you didn't, as a leader, ever really conceive of, and it could be better.
Yes.
And I think that's a real important thing. It reminds me a little bit of, there's a Amazon cultural, I don't know if it's a culture or value or way of working, but there's an Amazon thing that is a disagree and commit aspect of we want to hear your voice, even if it's awkward, even if it's hard.
Yeah.
And then if we make a decision, we want you fully on board and committed.
Yeah.
And that was a real interesting thing of saying, this is how we want to behave and want to be. Blizzard had one that was similar, that was every voice matters, but it missed the commitment part. And then that cultural, that part of that culture was actually kind of toxic, because people wouldn't commit to anything. They'd be like, no, I have this opinion and I'm always going to have this opinion, and you didn't listen to me, and so I don't need to be on board. And that was a place where, that was really good intention in the beginning.
Yes.
But as the company got bigger and bigger, it actually, and this is all my opinion, it was actually not that helpful, and it needed to be updated and modified.
Yes.
Based on what was actually happening in meetings and in decision making.
Yes.
And that's part of that feedback loop that didn't happen, of like, we're missing a part of this. This isn't quite working.
Yeah.
So anyways,
that's a great example, because I think that's an example of how leadership does have an opportunity to shape how culture is being expressed, right? And an opportunity to adapt it and change it. I'm sure that when Bill Gates founded Microsoft, he didn't intentionally mean, well, maybe he did, for the smartest person in the room to be, and the loudest person in the room to get their way. But that's how Microsoft ended up expressing it, as a company. And so it took a long time for the culture to shift out of that smartest person in the room is always right kind of mentality, and learn how to listen to people around the table, so to speak. And so I think that's a really great example. Like, you need to listen. I think even with something like, what is your policy going to be about hybrid, remote, or in-person work, right? And how, a great thing a leader can ask is, how can our policy be an expression of our values? Like, how can it help us meet our purpose? And if you can't answer those questions, then you may not have the right policy yet, right?
Yeah, well, I feel that remote hybrid battle that's going on is a cultural battle.
Yes.
It's employees saying, I think I don't like working here if this is the stance we're going to take on this policy.
Yeah.
And the leadership not really having a strong reason as to what their policy should be or what it was. But there was a lot of feedback back and forth between every company's leadership and the employees about how to land on a plan, or with most of them.
Yes.
And I do think that that's an interesting sort of feedback loop, that was going on. And I think some companies didn't do a good job at it.
Yeah.
Some companies did a good job. It is an example of that was kind of a cultural thing that happened that kind of needed to be co-created.
Yes.
Between the leaders and the employees.
Yes. And it can feel like you're kind of letting the genie out of the bottle a little bit. And so I think having, there's a really great ground conditions for change from a woman named Meg Wheatley, who's an expert in my field. And she talks about how one of the ground conditions for effective change and culture change is one of the biggest you can take on as an organization is people need to know how decisions will be made. It's not enough to get their input.
Right.
People also need to know, okay, so what are you going to do with our input once we give it to you? And that's a step that a lot of executives miss. And then people get pissed off because they thought, oh, wow, I thought that I thought that this was actually going to help us decide. Well, actually, we're going to take input and then we're going to let you know consensus wise what we think is going to work. Right. So you have to be really explicit about that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It does remind me that one of the things that plays through all three of those, important aspects of that is you have to work on culture all the time.
Yes.
It's not a one and done thing. You don't, write something down and post it, or you don't, etch it in bronze somewhere and put a plaque on the wall and go, okay, now that's our culture and let's move on.
Right.
You have to work on it. And I think, Craig said a great thing in the discussion we had, which is you're in a startup and the minute you hire a sales VP, your culture just changed. Whether you wanted to or not.
Yeah.
A big part of your culture now is sales. And that's a different dimension. So now you need to think about that. And what does that mean? And I think every company has those events that happen. We just acquired somebody.
Yeah.
That's a totally different culture. Now what happens?
Right.
And how do we manifest the right thing out of that? And
and if you have a value called diversity, you don't want to go in like the Borg and just say, you all need to now, integrate our values, right? You want to say, so what part of this still is going to live at LinkedIn or at whatever the subsidiary might be.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, this was kind of fun.
I think so. We're doing pretty well.
I think it's really fun that we get to have these projects together. And I'm super excited about the success you're getting with your podcast already.
Oh, it's just starting.
Yes.
As I say, I'm just a caboose on your train or whatever the metaphor is. Just following in your wake of greatness.
Oh, you're so funny.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Good to be here.
All right. Bye-bye.